afternoon, or almost good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We wanted to include in this thematic conference, based on the idea of together, something about performance spaces. And we were thinking, well, who's done performance spaces at different scales and in different countries that have got a lot of attention architecturally? And we lit on Christina Seilern, who's done buildings including, school concert halls, a magnificent concert hall in Switzerland, an emerging complex in Egypt, and her own background as an architect. When I first met her, was working with Raphael Vignoli on his walkie-talkie building. So she knows about workspace and therefore those sort of patterns of behavior that inform workspace design. But I think in a far more complex way, she absolutely understands the interaction between performers and audience, performance and backstage, that inevitable and essential engine room of the buildings that bring us all together for cultural experiences. So without further ado, please welcome Christina Seilern.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Paul. It's amazing, when I met Paul, it was probably 25 years ago, and the first person I met when I moved to London. So he's been a great supporter ever since. I want to talk about 4 projects, 2 of which are performances and 2 which are not. But one of the things that is quite apparent with every project, and I read a quote by D.H. Lawrence that said, when you're creating a book, sometimes you have to trust the story, not just the author. And I thought it was such a great thing, because every project essentially teaches you something, or you discover something new. And our work is essentially a linearity of what we learn through every project, and we always try to discover something. So this lecture is about acoustics, it's about volumetrics, it's about neuroscience, and it's about the perception of space and essentially how we play with these different elements. We're based in London. This is our office. But I'm going to talk to you about 3 materials that we use, and I keep calling them building materials, which is light, reflection, and sound. And these are materials that we essentially manipulate to do something with the architecture, to sort of give it a deeper, wider kind of effect. And this is something that I wrote a very long time ago, but it's something that I keep thinking about when doing projects, is that light, just like music, it's like pulse, it's the witness of time, it's the metaphor of life. So a building really comes alive with light, and a concert hall really comes alive with music. And so essentially these elements express the life and the vitality of a building. And when we talk about light, how do we manipulate light? First of all, it has to be captured. So I love this picture, which is essentially the water in the air capturing the light. Jim Turrell is a wonderful artist who has understood and manipulated light in ways that has influenced many of us. Nendo, this transparent lamp, where you kind of use light to essentially remove all sense of structure and gravity. And I think that's something that we do use quite a bit in our projects. And then reflection. This is my home country in Switzerland, but this idea that you can actually warp space, you can manipulate space through the use of reflection. So if we talk about acoustics, and this is really the part that this journey of these concert hall has taken me through, and they're 2 the 2 that I'm showing you, I've chosen simply because they're completely opposite problems. But what is interesting, when you look at the way architecture and music has evolved, there is quite a linearity between them. And it shows very early on in this relationship between the Gregorian chants, for example, and cathedral naves, and how the architecture and the music has evolved. And I found this chart, and I could understand the top bit, but I couldn't understand the bottom bit. And I've been talking to a conductor, and we're sort of looking at that and trying to understand how the two work together. But there is quite a distinct correlation between how music and architecture have worked together and influenced each other. Obviously, Gregorian chants need a lot of reverberation, and therefore churches are so good for it. But if you also look at the architecture and the music, Baroque music, at the time when the aristocracy were commissioning the music to be played in their living rooms or chamber orchestras, you can see the architecture being very sort of flourished and a little bit like the music, very rich. And so then you kind of move on to the classical style, the 18th century, Haydn and Beethoven, and the instruments become bigger. The grand piano comes into play, and the volumes become bigger. And this is when you started to develop the Musikverein, for example, in Vienna. It's considered one of the best acoustic spaces, and this is before we had all the programs that we now have for to understand the acoustics. They kind of did it through trial and error and realized that this box of 45 by 23 by 20 was really the box for the premium acoustics, and sort of was essentially repeated through the 19th century as the perfect acoustic space. And that came along with the fact that now it was no longer the aristocracy, being commissioning the music, but it sort of became much more democratic, and you had concert halls and you had the state commissioning music with larger orchestras. And then came Scharoun, and Scharoun kind of changed everything. Scharoun is, we consider him the Corbusier of architecture in terms of concert halls, because he moved away from the shoebox and went into the vineyard style and did this concert hall in the Philharmonie in Berlin, also considered one of the best acoustic spaces, where none of the floors are straight, everything angles slightly, and then the people are essentially organized around the orchestra. And so there's a much more intimate relationship between the musician and the audience. And that kind of suddenly opened up everything and loosened up everything. And at that time, the computer technology and the understanding, the physics of acoustics was evolving, and we started looking at it in a much more sort of engineered way rather than an intuitive way, the way we had for centuries. So where are we heading now? And this is where, in a sense, this experience or this looking at all these projects has led to these different problems. And I think that we are heading in a very interesting and different place. And that's something that I discovered completely by accident. So we had a project in Andermatt Concert Hall, and the project was all about boundaries. Essentially, the project was so bad at the beginning that I nearly thought I wasn't going to do it because I didn't think I could deliver something good. But essentially, we were given a bunker, which was supposed to be a ballroom for a hotel underground. And the client said, "Can you give me an acoustician? I want to turn it into a concert hall." And I said, "I'll give you the acoustician if you give me the project." I got the project. And then essentially he said, "Well, here we have this underground bunker, this space, and we want to turn it into a concert hall. And can you do some acoustic stuff on the walls and decorate it a bit and turn it into a concert hall?" And going there, I realized actually the volume is all wrong, the shape is all wrong, there's no natural light. It's sort of absolutely terrible. This is the state of which it was in when we found it, and you could see that it was essentially designed as a ballroom and essentially really didn't work. So I said to the client, look, it doesn't work. We need a bigger volume for the acoustics. We need more space. He had ambitions of putting a 75-piece orchestra. I said you could put a 4 or 5-piece orchestra, chamber music in there. And then I flew him to Berlin to see the opening of the Barenboim Divan Hall, which had exactly the same plan, but the volume, it had 13.5 meters compared to the 6.5 meters that we had. And we kind of sat around the different spaces, and I explained to him how acoustics and volume and visual all work together and how important that was. And so he then understood. But we had this other challenge that we had to build it in 18 months, design and build it, because they had a big opening then. And we couldn't get new planning, because planning in Switzerland takes years. And we couldn't do new foundations because that would be too expensive. So we had all these limitations. So we found a way that if we stand behind this line, this green line, which is a Swiss planning thing, and we cut the roof open and we lift the roof up, and then if we hang a backpack to it, we could essentially increase the volume significantly. And then what I also thought intuitively is that if you see bigger, you will hear bigger. And there was something so special about creating a concert hall in the Alps in Switzerland. There were no concert halls. I mean, there are small chamber music things, but they weren't proper concert hall that were able to accept an orchestra like the Berlin Philharmonic, which they wanted to do. So I thought, well, we really need to bring the mountains into this concert hall. It has to be absolutely special. But more importantly for us was this thing that if you saw this much larger space, the music would feel much larger and much bigger. And that was all theoretical. And we went along with it. And this was an early sketch, very, very early on. And then we thought, well, it's there, but it's not quite there yet. And then we started working we had 8 acousticians on this job, and we started working with an acoustician, and we started looking at electroacoustics. And what it does is that essentially it's a system that sorry, before that I have to tell you, we put the stage in the center, we wrapped the people around it, so this intimacy occurred. But then we wanted if you have a 75-piece orchestra in a volume of that size, you're going to be sort of overwhelmed by the music. And so we started looking at this electroacoustics, and that was very interesting, because what it does is it doesn't amplify music, it doesn't change the music. All it does is we have something like 75 speakers all around. We have 125 microphones everywhere, and all it does is it takes the music and throws it, so the natural acoustics works, and throws it back sort of microseconds later and dupes your brain into thinking that the space is bigger. So we said, this is great theoretically. We went to see a space and we tried the system. And what was extraordinary is actually when you change the system, the space started looking bigger, physically looking bigger. And it was obviously, it hadn't changed. And then once you went too much, once you put it on cathedral setting, your brain went, no, now you're fooling me, and it all fell apart. So there was this very slight moment when you can actually fool your brain into understanding the space. And what it made us realize is actually you perceive space through your eyes and through your ears. If you're in a closet, you know you're in a closet. If you're in a cathedral, you know you're in a cathedral. You don't need to open your eyes. So that's quite obvious. But what this did is it took our hall and acoustically amplified it to a much bigger hall, which meant that they could actually accept much larger orchestras. And what we've done is we've left it to the conductors to decide what reverberation times they want and how they want to use it. And the natural acoustics work perfectly. But if they want to heighten or change it, they can do that. And what's interesting is actually when we design for acoustics, we design for the orchestra. The audience understands, but the ones who really understand are the musicians. And so they always calibrate their concert hall before any concert to sort of suit them perfectly for the type of music they will be playing for and for the size of the orchestra. So that was in the hall before the change. And this is the same view after the change. So obviously the space grew quite dramatically. But what was really important was really this sense that you were sitting inside and you could see what was going on outside. And this notion that you can see the cable cars going up and you can see the mountains, and in the summer the cows are grazing, and imagine a winter when there's a blizzard and you're listening to music and you have this interaction with the outside, was very important. And it sort of aligned with this electroacoustics, which made the space feel bigger, and now visually it is bigger. What was difficult is we had to actually design the glass for this because of the acoustic requirements. We couldn't find a single glass, I mean, this is triple glazed, but a single glass pane that could deal with the 50 dB requirements that we had. And then we worked with the glazing manufacturers to get the right dB rating for certain decibels, and were able to get this very, very transparent glazing bespoke for this particular project. This is the plan. So you can see how we grew the plan from a small box to something slightly bigger. This is seen from the street. It's a very modest building when you go there. It's a tiny little pavilion, I would call, but actually down below it's quite a large concert hall, and essentially works as such. The whole shaping of the concert hall, all of this origami is very much done for the acoustics. So everything is angled according to the acoustic requirements, and to get the right level of spreading of the sounds throughout the hall. And you can see how we've integrated all the microphones and speakers to sort of not be visible. And this notion that you are sitting in a hall and looking at the mountains being so important. And all of these panels, some of them are acoustically transparent, some of them are reflective. All of this is sort of designed in a very sort of technical manner, but the result is something that sort of is very simple and uncomplicated. So that was the problem of having a small volume and trying to increase it, and finding ways, both architectural and as well as technological, to sort of grow it. Alguna was actually completely the opposite. Alguna was same client. This client develops cities rather than buildings, so he has an enormous need for architects, and kindly enough, he gave us another concert hall to do in El Gouna. And Gouna is, 300 kilometers south of Cairo on the Red Sea, a beautiful sort of waterfront resort. We were asked to essentially come up with a brief for a cultural center. They have hospitals, they have stadia, they have schools, they have hotels, I mean, you name it, it's a town, but they didn't have any culture, and they were doing all of their cultural elements sort of built up as festivals in between the spaces, and it was very complex to do every time. So they basically allowed us to find the site, and we decided to find the site shouldn't be a waterfront site, because that would be greedy. That's where they make the money as developers, as a waterfront site. So we didn't want to do a waterfront site, but we wanted to do something that would connect all the different old Gouna and new Gouna and all of these different areas, so that people, when they're driving around or walking around or bicycling around, will come by this element and by this cultural element. And we were very keen that we are now in Egypt, we're no longer in Switzerland, and we didn't want to come with our Western mentality of this is what a concert hall should look like, and we really wanted to do something that felt uniquely Egyptian and yet was not mimicking Egyptian architecture. This game of mimicry, I find, is sort of not exactly the right thing, but I wanted it to feel that this project could only exist in Egypt and nowhere else. And this notion of scale, and the scale of the sculptures and the scale of the colonnades that they have in Luxor is quite something, and we wanted to play, and the simplicity of it all. I mean, if you think of the pyramid, the simplicity of their architecture is something that we played with. And the other thing that was interesting is that the arch is a Moorish invention, a typology that's been used over the centuries, and it's something, again, that we wanted to play with. And so we put the building essentially on a 30,000 square meter of a body of water, which is all gravity fed, so no pumps, because we are in Gouna, the city of water. And then essentially we covered the concert hall in yellow, the conference center in blue, and the outdoor film festival area. And then we created these colonnades around the building. And that was simply to create two things: to create sunshade and protect the buildings from the strong winds of Gouna, Guna, but also to be able to build this in 3 different phases. Phase 1 being the colonnade, phase 2 being the concert hall, and phase 3 being the conference center. So phase 1 is built, phase 2 is we finished CDs, so they're going to build at some point. But this idea that it becomes a public square that can be used all the time for festivals and outside of for weddings, for you name it. So it had to be something that was usable and flexible, and also have the the sort of high views of culture and music. This idea of colonnade was something we were appointed in January, and we had to complete phase 1 by September, so it was incredibly quick. So we had to design the concert hall, the conference center, and the colonnades all and build it at the same time. But we thought, how can we reinvent the colonnade? And what we did is a very simple move of taking columns and just staggering them and then arranging them to just find a new typology for these arches. And then we played with the scale, and we played with the scale of Egypt, and we amplified them to 20 meters and 18 meters, etc., and giving this sense of this uniquely Egyptian scale. But we were also very keen that it shouldn't be too monumental. It should have a softness. It should, feel that it comes from the sand, from the area. And so we created this interior, and you can see in the middle view, once you stagger the arches, it creates a very complex geometry. And so we had to come up with a geometry that would be able to be built and yet absolutely flawless at the top. And you can see how we developed it. This is on site. So these are all GRC, glass reinforced concrete panels that we installed. And you can see here the scale. That's me next to one of these panels. And they did an absolutely beautiful job of building them with absolute flawless connection in between. And I was so impressed with the quality of craftsmanship in the middle of nowhere in Egypt. But this softness of sand and feeling that you are in, it's like a cave in the middle of the desert. And you can see here some of the views. This is the plan, so the 30,000 square meter reflecting pool around it. One of the reasons we chose this site was that it was next to the Nubian village, which is where a lot of the workers live, and actually I think it's one of the prettiest villages in all of Guna. But more importantly, it was next to this body of water, and we wanted to take the water, flow it through our building, through our plazas, and then reject it again without the use of any kind of pumps, and sort of allowing it all to be gravity fed. These are the 3 phases. So you can see phase 1 completed, the plazas and the colonnades that they've been using for weddings and for other events. Phase 2 now the concert hall, which I'm going to take you into. These are some of the views of what is built now. So we designed the plazas essentially to receive these future buildings, and that they can be built easily, once they're ready to build it. And these are the early renderings. This is the building. This is the concert hall building. We were using a local Egyptian stone. They love concrete. The client owns Lafarge in Egypt, so they absolutely love concrete, and we were trying desperately not to use concrete. And so we found an Egyptian stone that if we CNC'd it was actually more cost effective than concrete, and that was a great way to be slightly more environmental. I'll take you through it. And now the concert hall. The concert hall was actually the completely opposite elements. The client wanted a 125-piece orchestra so that they could play Aida and some big pieces in there, but only an audience of 600. And when you have a 125-piece orchestra, you usually have an audience of 2,000 because it just doesn't make sense. So most large concert halls have large audiences. And so when you design a concert hall, you start with a stage, and you design the stage, and you place your instrument, your musicians on it, and you size the stage, and then you start building the audience around it. And again, like Sharoon, and like Andermatt, I wanted to wrap the audience around the orchestra, so you have this very intimate connection. And because 600 is not a big audience, we wanted everybody to see each other and sort of feel part of the same element. And then we put the acoustic reflector above the orchestra, as you need to. And then the problem was that the acoustic box, the shoe box that worked so well for acoustics, 43 by 20 by 24, would have totally overwhelmed the audience. And it would have been like sitting in an IKEA box while this orchestra was going on. So it just didn't feel right. And so our solution was to create what we call the intimacy dome. And the intimacy dome is completely acoustically transparent, but visually solid. And it allows light and sound to go through. But more importantly, it compresses the space into a much more intimate space that allows this relationship between the orchestra and the audience to occur without the feeling that you're in this big dark box. And then we placed the acoustic box around it, and this is where you put all the speakers and the reflectors and the curtains and all of the things that you want to do for variable acoustics that usually look quite ugly in a concert hall. And everything is hidden, the lights, the microphones, the speakers, all of that can be put into more technical space, and people arrive in the technical space, see the technical space, and then walk into this very organic space. And this is the reflected ceiling plan, but this was really inspired from this, the mountains behind Guna, and this notion of being within the sand, within the mountains, and compressed by the space, and light shafts being able to come through and light up the stage. And this was our very first rendering, where we imagined this idea of being compressed by the space. Obviously, it didn't work because we did it out of wood and the acoustician had a heart attack. But then we moved on and started looking at it, how we could resolve the same idea with a mesh, a transparent mesh, and hanging all of this and allowing the light, these shafts of light to come into the space, and this sort of very intimate relationship between musicians and audience. And here I'm flipping through some of the festival plaza. The construction occurred before the pandemic and during the pandemic, and it was quite interesting because Alberto, who's here, and we were all sitting on WhatsApp and sort of telling the landscape architect to move the palm tree to the left, and then we came after the pandemic to see it pretty much built. This is the Nuban village and the relationship with the building. They have one of the best views of the building. And this idea of the reflection and how it really makes it a sort of a space for Guna, this is the tallest building in Guna. There's a height limit of 12 meters in Guna, and this is sort of the cultural space, the one that was allowed to go higher, but also really plays with this idea that Guna is a city of water, and these reflections really add to the lighting and to the effect of the space. And this is how they use it. So this was the film festival. They have the annual World Championship of squash there every year. They have ginormous weddings and all sorts of events that happen there. So they are actively using it all year round, currently as Festival Plaza. And then as the concert hall gets built, they'll use the other plaza, and eventually the conference center will get built, hopefully. And I'll just show you a movie. I think it's always better to see it moving, so.
We're here at the Guna Plaza. It's the site for the Guna Conference and Culture Center. It's built over a 30,000 square meter area. It was built in a period of 16 weeks in October 2019. So the inspiration behind this project was Samih Sawiris' time spent in Berlin, where he fell in love with orchestra, with classical music, attending many concerts at the Berlin Philharmonic. This gave him the inspiration basically to build a site here in the heart of Guna to have these similar concert, cultural events, including the Guna Film Festival, which is at its 5th edition, as well as the International Squash Tournament in Lisbon. So we partnered with Studio Seilern to come up with this beautiful architecture that we have here at the GCCC in Guna.
The project came about because we had just completed a concert hall in Switzerland, the Animat Concert Hall. We designed the plaza and the colonnades really as a way to protect and create a public space, and which would enclose the buildings and unify the buildings. into sort of a celebration plaza. And suddenly the whole thing becomes what it wants to become, which is essentially these colonnades that sit lightly on its toes and is reflected in the waters. We are contextualists, so we were really keen on understanding what kind of impact we would have to this beautiful country, which has an extraordinary architectural legacy. I love the skater. It gives scale. There you go. Good now. I'm going to talk to you now, moving away from acoustics and just about together. And this idea, I find it absolutely fascinating how the Middle East is building these new cities in generations. I mean, I'm talking 1 or 2 generations, and the speed at which it's all going. And it's sort of, it's daunting, it's frightening, it's exciting, it's everything. And obviously mistakes are made, but also some wonderful architecture is made. And we were invited to this competition in Dubai, actually to do 2 towers, and then it ended up being only 1 tower. And it's a competition that we won quite wonderfully, but it's next to Dubai Creek Tower. And Dubai Creek Tower is the same developer as the Burj Dubai. And essentially it's a kilometer-tall Eiffel Tower with a viewing platform on top, done by Calatrava. And that was sort of the epicenter of that site, of the Dubai Creek Tower. And you can see the master plan, how it really organizes itself around this giant Eiffel Tower. And our sites were on either end of the phase 1. So you can see here phase 1. We were given 2 sites to choose from adjacent to this tower. But what's interesting is that they were building around the Calatrava Tower. They were building 300-meter towers. And so imagine the Shard, but about 15 of them around this one tower. So the ambition of it was just so extraordinary and so sort of daunting. And these were the images that we were given. Again, I think slightly daunting, and you can see all the architecture around it. And we wanted to sort of think about it in a different way. And this is the 300-meter tower complex around this Calatrava Tower, which is 1 kilometer tall, and it sort of is proportionally, everything is absolutely scaled up. But the brief was a 200,000 square meters, 30% hotel, 75% residential, a 300-meter tower. And the thing that bothered me was the interesting shape, because I didn't like that concept of an interesting shape. Balcony at every level. I think it's very difficult to do a good-looking building with balconies at every level. And then you had to build it on a 24-meter plinth, because that was what the master plan was asking for. So very little street connection. So all things that we found quite challenging. Next to our site was this half a kilometer long retail frontage. And we were basically on a 24-meter plinth, and you can see how all these buildings are essentially built on top of this retail plinth, and then you have residential entrances for all the buildings. And again, we found that challenging, that your front door is between 2 shops, and we wanted to rethink that portion as well. And one of the most successful urban gestures, I think, are the Spanish Steps in Rome. They're always filled with tourists, but there's something so spectacular about this very simple gesture and creating this very natural auditorium, unthought of auditorium in the middle of a square. And so our idea for the 24-meter plinth was to say that there's no point of putting more retail in there. We can put conferences in that area. and really let's create an auditorium to look at the spectacle of this Calatrava Tower in all its glory and allow people to sit outside in a cascading garden that goes down towards the Calatrava garden below, and this idea of sitting on this 20 plus 24 meter plinth. And then so this is on one side, and then we put all the services at the back, and Congress and retail, etc. And then we create this tower up above, and you can see here the Spanish Steps with a water feature for a little bit of evaporative cooling, but essentially this feature that created an auditorium onto the Calatrava Tower. And you can see here the scale. So this is 300 meters. It's like the Shard in London and the Calatrava Tower, which is 1 kilometer tall. And the other thing that bothered me in Dubai, sitting in meetings, is that you would all see these guys outside dangling in their baskets because of the wind and the sand in the wind. The cleaning of these glass towers has to happen all the time. And so it's kind of slightly ridiculous to build glass towers in the middle of the deserts with its sandy winds. And we thought, what if we could create a 300-meter tower that could be cleaned by one person safely sitting on ground, not dangling and not needing a special certificate. And that was the parameter for our building. So we built the most efficient building, which is a square tower, which gives you the 70 to 75% efficiency that they wanted. And then we wrapped the whole thing essentially with balconies all the way around. And what it did is that when you're going up the Calatrava Tower, it created, and this was a total accident, we had no idea, but it created this wonderful moiré effect of, depending on what height you are, the building becomes completely transparent at different heights. And that was something that we thought was very exciting. And this is the building. I think the proportions are all off, by the way. Are they off? No? Maybe because oh no, it's better there. But we essentially, by wrapping these balconies around, we then allowed every level, every hotel room, every residential to have an outside garden, outside space that was significant, that we could green. And just by moving the balustrade behind, you never see the edge of the balcony. You don't see people putting their bicycles or putting their stuff in the balcony. And what it did is it allowed this tower to feel like these slabs or these balconies are magically floating, and you can't see the structure, and the whole thing is kind of dematerialized. I can never say that word. And you can see it here closer with the Spanish Steps and moving up from the Calatrava Tower. This is a view from further. And what was interesting is the reason we went and wrapped the balconies, and they're 8 meters deep at the bottom where the hotel is, because a hotel can benefit from outdoor spaces for restaurants and swimming pools, etc. Whereas as you come up, the wind becomes higher and the balcony becomes less usable because of the high winds. But we also discovered that at the 40th floor, your urban engagement with the street is no longer there, and therefore actually it's much more about the longer views. And these are the balconies. So these are the balconies at the lower floors, which probably, I don't know, they're 4, 5, 6 meters in this one. And then as you go up, they become smaller. But every level has its balcony and has its privacy. And that was this idea. And we started developing how we could create these balconies and really create these very thin floating balcony slabs by hanging them from the structure and allowing them to give this impression of weightlessness. And then just by coloring it from the colors of the desert, we discovered that the shading, the natural shading of the building as the balconies recessed and the shading became less prominent, it naturally did the same coloring as the desert does, from a gold to a white. And so that was that. Some of the same views. And the notion that you can have a swimming pool that is completely open and yet completely private from the overlooking of the neighbors was something that was interesting. I'm running out, so I won't show you the last one. All right. Last one, I'll run through it. It's all images anyway. This is a very personal project. This is a house in Paros. It's a personal project for us. we built in an olive grove, beautiful site, beautiful landscape, and essentially we had this olive grove that we wanted to maintain, so we created essentially a building which is a village within an olive grove rather than a building within an olive grove. But the most important thing was this arrival and this drama of the sunset. You know, when people come in the evening, they come at 7 for the sunset, and we wanted to create this very dramatic entrance, and we created this arrival that sort of culminated in the end with this cantilevering pool that overlooked the sea. And you can see here some of the views. The pool is 45 meters, but it's actually fake because we've put a lot of shallow pieces of water because I didn't want to have such a large pool, but I wanted the effect of the larger pool. We had to protect it from the wind, very strong wind, so we created these walls so that you can mostly sit outside. We're always outside, we're never inside, and we created these mounds. We learned all of this from Guna, because Guna is very windy, and these walls to allow the outdoor spaces to be completely usable while you have a Beaufort 7 winds outside, and you can still use it. And this reflecting pool, we essentially gave the impression of cantilevering the pool by creating this effect of using mirrors and this idea of reflection and how we can warp space. So we created the mirrors underneath and allowed the garden to reclaim the space that we took away from it for the pool, and give this impression that there's a very thin pool just floating above the landscaping and allowing the garden to be reflected in it. And you see this is quite dramatic at night when it's constantly changing personality. When you're swimming in it, you feel as if you're levitating because the trees are lower than you. And then one last element that we did, it's very simple architecture. In Greece, we wanted to keep it simple. But one of the beautiful moves that they do, they've never had a lot of money, but they did these beautifully carved Naxos marble entrances around the doors and the windows when, you know, the churches and the municipal buildings, when there was a little bit more money. And so we borrowed this idea, and using this Greek Aliveri marble and sort of sandblasting it and creating these windows around the perimeter of the doors and the windows to give some kind of effect, and this inspiration from the local vernacular. Again, this idea of reflection and this idea of light, weightlessness, and all of the platforms seem to be floating and never really touching the water. And so the work with the terrazzo, I call him terrazzo man, Nikos. I mean, we spent a lot of time filing the terrazzo together and deciding on the details on site. But this relationship between reflection and the different materials, every piece of terrazzo is slightly different, and it could be called 50 Shades of Grey, this building, because it is 50 Shades of Grey, but very simple materials, very humble materials. And then finally the last gesture of the large canopy protecting the outdoor spaces from the sun. And one thing that I wanted to do, every house in Greece has all the same canopies, and I wanted to do something very different. And I wanted this eucalyptus wood to feel as if it's just floating there and you can't see the structure. And all the lights and the speakers, again, all of that informed by our performance art spaces history. We wanted to hide all of that. We didn't want to see any of it. And so we hid everything. So that, again, is an acoustically transparent canopy that provides a kind of shade. And this is together as a family. I thought it was a nice way to end, and the perspective, the indoor-outdoor. I have to move quickly. We designed all the furniture from the local stones. It's wonderful what you can do. My daughter. And the final video. It's very short. Thank you. Sure. You can stop it if you want. All right. Thank you.
Well, just an observation, which is that there are buildings that are designed for performances, and actually what you've shown us is two buildings that were designed for just that, but then you showed us two buildings that actually perform themselves. So I think it's a wonderful kind of way of reconciling performance and non-performance buildings. They're not that different. Christina Seilern, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.